Well, let's bring Mark Anderson in. And of course, Mark, migration is one of those topics that we're told we can't talk about, and many people are fearful about talking about the subject of migration. What have you got to report?
Well, it's a rather broad item. Here in the first slide, we have contractor that moved migrants from Florida wins contract to build their tents here. Here is Chicago. That's what the word here is referring to. And Chicago is establishing tent cities for housing large numbers, increasingly large numbers of so-called migrants. And this next slide is from that publication that showed that photo, Crain's Chicago Business. It's a business journal. The mainstream papers just don't even really know what to do with this. They're out to lunch all the time, like we're talking about a few minutes ago. Here we see the city of Chicago partnered with the state of Illinois, Liberal Governor J.B. Pritzker there, a global cities advocate, last week to quietly award up to $29 million in a contract to erect large tents to serve as base camps in an effort to expeditiously move migrants from the city's police stations before winter. The contract was awarded just a few days after Mayor Brandon Johnson announced plans to move with expediency to transfer the nearly 1,600 migrants currently living in the city's police stations and in the airports, and then move them to base camps before winter. And we'll move on from there. This issue kind of mushrooms out. Now, in Texas, there's a very controversial and somewhat nebulous issue going on, and I'll explain. Houston area development, just north of Houston, has become a right-wing rod in immigration. This is, of course, according to the myopic Texas Tribune, which doesn't even do as well as a broken clock. A broken clock is at least right twice a day. The Texas Tribune can't seem to do that. But after conservative, moving on, it's referring to Colony Ridge, a massive residential development 30 to 40 miles north of Houston in Liberty County. We'll describe this as we go along. That's what's taking center stage in Texas politics. We talked about Chicago. Keep the tent cities in mind. After weeks of reports in conservative media portraying Colony Ridge, this development, as a magnet for illegal immigrants, followed by state Republican leaders expressing alarm, Governor Greg Abbott of Texas has promised that Colony Ridge will be addressed in an upcoming special legislative session while saying, quote, serious concerns have been raised. The Texas legislature meets every other year officially on the odd number. And so when they call a special session, it's pretty important. And I'll keep going on this one. We're trying to put together as much information as possible, says Abbott, so that I can add to that special session any issue that needs to be enforced in terms of a new law in the state of Texas to make sure that we're not going to have colonies, illegal immigrant colonies, they say, like this in our state. The precise issues are unclear. Abbott suggested he's worried Colony Ridge has become a no-go zone where the state's ban on sanctuary cities is not being enforced. So Texas has banned officially sanctuary cities, but Abbott says this runs the risk of abridging that. Legal experts say there is no law against selling land to people who aren't citizens, and many of the more outlandish claims about the neighborhood have been accompanied with little or no evidence. That's not really true. To purchase land in the United States, at least you need a social security number and a U.S. ID. And so non-citizens buying land is, I think, especially on the poorer end of the scale, a very unlikely thing, and I think actually would have legal prohibitions. But here in this next slide, we see on that red marker where Liberty County is, where Colony Ridge is located. It's in east central Texas, just north of Houston. Abbott said the state has issued subpoenas to the developers to find out what's going on financially. The developing company, Toronto's Houston, which means land for sale in Houston, roughly, has dismissed suggestions that Colony Ridge is a haven for people in the country illegally, saying that's slanderous and unsubstantiated. Get this, though, developer William Trey Harris, a Colony Ridge developer, is a major campaign donor to Governor Abbott. That I have independently confirmed is true. That company has also given money to the Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, and to the Speaker of the Texas House, Dade Phelan. So on the one side, they're saying we're worried about this development. On the other side, developers of that development have given money to these major politicians in the Lone Star State. Et cetera, et cetera. The development located in rural Liberty County, as I'm showing there, north of Houston, is comprised of multiple subdivisions, according to a column that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick wrote after his flyover in a helicopter. The developer told Patrick that the development covers nearly 33,000 acres and is home to about 10,000 people. I've heard much higher numbers, and I've heard it approaches 60 square miles, which is almost the size of Washington, D.C. in size. And this is from the Lieutenant Governor's website itself, the fastest growing community in Texas. Recently, I've read stories on Colony Ridge, wrote Dan Patrick, sometimes called Plume Grove because it's near that tiny city, and I wanted to see it for myself. Until now, Colony Ridge hasn't received much attention from local or national media. However, the developer continued to purchase and clear a lot of land, and people began to take notice. We'll move on from there. And this is the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick describing this during his flyover. It's a massive development covering 50 square miles. Again, I've heard 60, and it's growing, 33,000 acres. It's the fastest growing and biggest housing development I've seen anywhere in Texas. So this is another aspect to this. We have the developments in Chicago. Now we have the Colony Ridge controversy in Texas, with one side saying it's going to be a huge haven for illegals, a way to settle them rather than putting them all over the country. The other side saying there's little or nothing to worry about. The developers saying it's all exaggerated or a falsehood. Now, moving on from there, this is the Voice of America, part of the propaganda arm of the United States connected to the CIA. This is a headline: Migrants face long waiting list at the new U.S. processing centers in Latin America. So this is the U.S. government's Voice of America on August 30th. And I'm showing the New York Times that I bought here, page A4 on the 22nd of September, sharing a similar perspective, talking about these new processing centers. We've got a video clip in a minute. But what's going on, according to Wyatt Watson, one of my better sources in the field about the southern border, is that Biden appears to be developing, in Wyatt's opinion, these processing centers so he can encourage more people not to come all the way to the border, process them further away from the United States, and then bring them in without all the controversy that the border jumpers cause, the illegal entries at the border, and kind of calm the nerves of many Americans who are very concerned about these things. And then there would be a less visible but increasingly large transfer of illegals from these processing centers throughout Central America and Mexico, and they would be more quietly shuttled into the United States. And the fear, Brian, is that they'll then go to places like Colony Ridge, and there'll be huge settlements of illegals where it'll be a lot less detectable that they're coming in increasingly large numbers. So it's kind of a broad brushstroke today. Some of this is very tentative, but this gives UK column viewers a very early view, an advanced view of what might be happening. Large settlements being quietly put together of largely illegal aliens without Americans being aware, but supposedly that would reduce the people who are coming to the border illegally and crossing over, jumping over barbed wire, putting blankets over barbed wire and crawling across, which just happened September 28th, according to Current Revolt, a news source in Texas. But I believe we have a video clip, and that'll kind of round out this initial preliminary report for today, if that's available.
When Ninfa Ramos and her children left Venezuela for Colombia 5 years ago,
Son los documentos de Venezuela.
her adult children found work, and the family found legal status and a long-term home here in Medellin, Colombia. But now, their income and expenses no longer match up, and their situation has become more desperate.
Aquí estamos.
Here we are living the same as we lived in Venezuela. We have the fear that it will also be the same.
Temor de que también sea lo mismo.
Ninfa takes care of her 3 young grandchildren while their parents work long hours in bakeries and as a cargo truck driver. A few months ago, they decided to go to the U.S., where they have family in Florida. They hope to find a way to get there legally and quickly.
If tomorrow they tell us it's approved and we need to leave, we'll leave immediately.
Nos vamos inmediatamente.
But the quick legal entry to the U.S. that Ninfa and her family want is unlikely. She is one of 28,000 people in Colombia who applied to new U.S.-run facilities called Safe Mobility Offices. They're processing centers in Latin America designed to screen people for safe and orderly ways to reach the U.S., instead of making the dangerous trek to the U.S.-Mexico border.
Well, everywhere we go in the world, turmoil, and as a result of migration. And of course, we have said many times, we'll repeat it, Peter Sutherland, former ambassador for migration in the UN, said that the migration was necessary to break down the homogeneity of the nation state. David, let's come